The Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden and Limited list has to be one of the most iconic aspects in the physical trading card game. I'm sure we've all seen a couple of our favorite Yu-Gi tubers react to the ban list whenever Konami decides to drop one. But here's the question, how many of these ban lists have you actually endured in your time playing this game? Are you a hardened veteran that's been playing this game ever since its inception back in 2002? Or are you a brand new player that decided to pick this game up recently? Well, in this series, I plan on excavating the history of Yu-Gi-Oh's Forbidden and Limited list. I will be going over every single ban list starting from the very first one and progressing all the way up to the most recent one, explaining the reason why certain cards got the limitations they did, and deciding whether or not they were warranted. I'll be your host, Topsy Turnip, and this is Banned Throughout the Ages. The date was May 7th, 2002. And the very first Forbidden and Limited list was released in the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG. This list included cards from the current sets available at that time, those being Booster Pack Legends of Blue Eyes White Dragon, Starter Deck Kaiba, and Starter Deck Yugi. There was a grand total of 12 cards on this list. Let's go ahead and break down those aforementioned cards. The first Forbidden and Limited list had 2 cards semi-limited and the other 10 were all limited to 1. With that being established, let's start our list off with the semi-limited section, which consists of Swords of Revealing Light and Card Destruction. Swords of Revealing Light, an extremely iconic card for anyone that grew up watching the Duel Monsters Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime, or anyone who played early Yu-Gi-Oh! Formats. So, how did this very iconic card find its way into the Forbidden and Limited list? Let's go ahead and read this card in order to get an idea of what exactly it does. As a heads up, I will be using the original text of the card in order to get a better understanding as to why the card got limited back then. With that out of the way now, let's get started. Swords of Revealing Light is a normal spell card with the effect, counting from your opponent's turn. None of your opponent's monsters can attack for 3 turns of his or her own. When this card is activated, opponents face down monsters at that time are turned face up but remain in defense position. Any effects the monsters may have are immediately activated. Whew, okay, well, that was quite the mouthful. Let's now explore why Swords was semi-limited. In the initial stages of the game, Swords was a main staple of any deck that had access to the card. It did not matter what type of deck you were running. You could be playing an aggro deck or a slow control deck. No matter, the only thing that remained consistent between all these decks was the fact that this card was too good not to play in them. The prevalence of this card could be seen far and wide and will remain an integral part of many decks for future formats, as long as this card remained legal. But what made this card so powerful that Konami had to give it some form of limitation? Well, it was a combination of the unbalanced nature of the card and the lack of counterplay that got this card in the Forbidden and Limited list. Swords of Revealing Light was an incredibly powerful tool used by many decks to stall out a whole 3 turns. While in terms of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! A card like Swords seems incredibly weak and lackluster, in the context of 2002, having a whole 3 turns of your opponent not being able to attack your life points or your monsters could result in an enormous tempo swing in your favor. This would allow a player to establish a board presence and in the process dismantle their opponent's board at the same time. Also, since your opponent could not attack you for a whole 3 turns, that meant that you had a chance to stumble upon any of your powerful staples in your deck. Not only that, but you could also preemptively trigger your opponent's flip effect monsters, like Man-Eater Bug, Hane, and Wall of Illusion, to mitigate their usefulness. The amount of utility this card offered made Swords an extremely versatile card, but the final cherry on top for this card was the fact that it had almost zero counterplay. This was due to the fact that the only cards that could reliably deal with Swords were cards such as Armed Ninja or Dispel, 2 incredibly weak cards that saw some fringe play. But if Swords was such a powerful and problematic card, why did these cards not see a lot of play? Well, it was because these 2 cards were very unreliable. Both Armed Ninja and Dispel were single target removal, and at that they were single target removal for specifically spell cards. In these early stages of the game, your opponent had no real reason to set their spell cards, since quick play spell cards were not yet a thing, and the only other reason they would do it is to set a bluff. So for that reason, playing a card like Dispel or Armed Ninja seemed very obsolete and would only take up valuable deck space. Now then, was the semi-limit of Swords warranted? Well, when we take into consideration the abundance of play the card saw, the versatility of it, and the fact that it was an incredibly tough card to out, I think that the semi-limiting of this card was indeed a fair decision to make. Up next for the semi-limited list, we have Card Destruction. Card Destruction, a normal spell card with the effect. Both players must discard their entire hand and draw the same number of cards they discarded from their respective decks. Now that we know what this card does, let's find out why this card was semi-limited. And we'll start that off by figuring out what decks were actually playing this card. I spent some time looking online trying to figure out who was playing this card in these early stages of the game. And after all that searching, I found myself looking through a Pojo forum that had people discussing tech choices for the early LOB format and the reason why they were playing these cards. And from that forum, I ended up finding that there was one of three reasons why this card was seen play. Number 1. Since the most dominant decks in these early stages of the game were two different versions of Beatdown, that being Summon Skull Beatdown and Dragon Beatdown, Card Destruction allowed the player using it to set up their graveyard with these powerful beaters that they could then later bring back with a card such as Monster Reborn. At the same time, this would also allow that player to dig through their deck a couple cards deeper in order to find some of their powerful staples to continue on with their plays. Number 2. This card would sometimes be used as a defensive card. Some players would opt to use Card Destruction as a preemptive move to get rid of some of your opponent's most powerful cards, such as Regeki or Darkhole. A player would do this by trying to read their opponent to see whether or not they were holding on to some of these powerful staples. Also, in some random instances, this could also be used as a way to counter Exodia decks, since if you got rid of any of their Exodia pieces, they essentially had to scoop right then and there. And finally, number 3. The reason I believe this card actually got limited. This card would often see play in many stall/mill decks, in order to dwindle down their opponent's decks to a more manageable size to then stall out the rest of the duel with cards such as Swords of Revealing Light and Waboku, to then go ahead and deck out their opponent. Playing against a deck like this would be an extremely unfun and frustrating experience, since your opponent would continuously not let you play the game and at the same time keep picking away at your hand. With that being established, was the limitation of this card warranted? Well, after analyzing all the uses of this card, it makes a bit more sense as to why it would get the small hit that it did, especially when taking into consideration that mill/stall decks played this card. This card seemed like a very annoying but niche card that would occasionally pop up here and there. While it wasn't meta warping or anything, it's probably best if decks that wanted to play this degenerate strategy didn't have a full access to 3. So ultimately, it seems fair for the card to be hit to 2. Nothing too harsh, but enough to discourage other players from playing it. And with that, we wrap up the semi-limited list. Next up, we have the limited list, which consists of 10 cards, which are the 5 pieces of Exodia, Regeki, Darkhole, Monster Reborn, Change of Heart, and Pot of Greed. We'll start off the limited list with the 5 pieces of Exodia, which, as you can imagine, consists of 5 separate cards, which are Right Leg of the Forbidden One, Left Leg of the Forbidden One, Right Arm of the Forbidden One, Left Arm of the Forbidden One, and finally, Exodia the Forbidden One. Of those 5, 4 of them are non-effect vanilla monsters, which is something very odd to see, having not 1 but 4 non-effect monsters hit in the Forbidden and Limited list. Now then, what in the world is the effect of the final piece of Exodia that had Konami clutching for their pearls and decide to hit all 5 pieces? Well, let's have a look. As stated before, Exodia the Forbidden One consists of 5 separate cards. All 5 of them are dark spellcaster monsters, with the limbs all being level 1 and the head being the level 3. The one effect monster, being the head, has the following effect. If you have right leg of the Forbidden One, left leg of the Forbidden One, right arm of the Forbidden One, and left arm of the Forbidden One, in addition to this card in your hand, you win the duel. Okay then, so Exodia's a win condition. Makes sense as to why Konami would limit these cards, right? That is the most powerful effect a monster can be given, the effect to just outright win the game. While it is true that winning the duel is the most powerful effect in the game, only second to winning the match, the devil's in the details though. How are you accomplishing this effect? The win condition of Exodia requires the player to assemble all 5 pieces in their hand in order to win the duel, which is a task easier said than done, especially when taking a look through the scope of a 2002 Yu-Gi-Oh format. So why did Konami deem it necessary to give Exodia such a harsh limitation? Well, while looking around for any reasonable reason for its limitation, the best I could formulate was just the fact that Konami was being extra cautious with a card that literally has the effect of winning you the game. The Exodia deck has never truly been a good deck that players should fear, due to the fact that there's numerous ways to stop it. And even in the pre-Banlist era where Pot of Greed was at 3, the fact remained that the best way to play Exodia decks was always just playing all the limbs at 1, since all the worst hands in an Exodia deck were always hands that had multiple limbs in them. So I guess we're back to where we started then. Why were these cards all hit to 1? It seems silly to limit all the limbs of Exodia, right? Since it appears that even the people that played this deck seem to acknowledge the fact that the best way to play the deck is just by playing them all at 1. So what gives? So after being back at square one and trying to figure out as to why Exodia got limited, I ended up going back online. I ended up going through some Reddit threads of people talking about Exodia. And it seems that people are convinced of one of two things. Either 1, Konami completely forgot about Exodia and never bothered to unlimit it again, or 2, there's lore significance to Exodia being limited. Since in the anime, Exodia is meant to be such a rare card that not many people have, it goes to follow that the card should be only at 1 in everyone's deck. In the end, I was upset with both of these answers, since both of them seem like very weak reasons to go ahead and limit a card. But regardless of what the actual reason for Exodia's limitation was, it remains one of the weirdest cards to be placed on the ban list. So what's the final verdict? Was Exodia's limitation warranted or not? Ultimately, I want to say no. And even while looking back to see whether or not there'd be some unfair combo or anything weird that you could do with the Exodia pieces, I came out seeing that every single other way you could play Exodia just seems more inconsistent than the way that it's being played right now. You could try and cheese out some victory with a card such as like Heart of the Underdog or White Elephant Gift, but nevertheless, these strategies aren't that good. So I think ultimately I have to say that no, Exodia's limitation was not warranted and could easily be at 3 and still not cause an issue. Up next for the limited section, we have Regeki and Darkhole. Regeki and Darkhole. Both of these are normal spell cards with very similar effects. We'll start off with Regeki, which reads, destroy all of your opponent's monsters on the field. Alright, next up we have Darkhole, which reads, destroy all monsters on the field. So, after reading both of these cards' effects, I doubt anybody's confused and befuddled as to why both of these were limited. Regeki and Darkhole are two ultra iconic board wipes that remain prevalent throughout most of their life throughout the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Both of these cards were incredibly unbalanced at these early stages of the game, and would have pretty much solidified the victory of the first player that saw either one of these. There truly was no way to play around either Regeki or Darkhole, since they would just straight up nuke the board whenever they activated. Both Regeki and Darkhole did not care about the board state. They did not care what position the monsters were in, or what the attack of the monster was. For example, some popular cards that were being played alongside Regeki and Darkhole were both Fissure and Trap Hole, two cards that would destroy a single card on the field, and at that had certain requirements that they had to meet in order to activate. In Fissure's case, it had to be activated on your opponent's weakest face-up monster, and in Trap Hole's case, it had to be used on a monster with 1,000 or less attack, and at that, it had to be used on the normal summon or flip summon of a monster. These cards were so powerful that even Darkhole, the one that was supposed to be the weaker version of Regeki, got the same treatment as Regeki during this Forbidden and Limited list. Darkhole was meant to be the balanced version of Regeki since it would destroy monsters on both sides of the field. But of course this was hardly a hindrance for this card since there was no activation requirement for it, so you could just use it whenever you wanted. Now then, as you can imagine, these two cards saw widespread play in every single deck that had access to them. These cards especially saw play in the best decks in the format, that being the 2 beatdown strategies. When playing against these decks, a single Regeki or a well-timed Darkhole, it would be too much for some of the slower control decks to be able to counter it or recover from it. The aggro decks ruled supreme in these early developing meta, and would continue for some time. The limitation of these two cards was something that was desperately needed, just due to the serious unbalanced nature of these cards, and Konami was 100% justified in the limitation of these cards. If anything, these cards probably deserved to have been banned early on, just for the fact that they were so unbalanced when we compare it to the other form of removal in the game. And with that, we'll move on to the next card on the list. Next up on the list, we have Monster Reborn, a normal spell card with the effect. Select one monster from either your opponent's or your own graveyard and place it on the field under your control in attack or defense position, face up. This is considered a special summon. Now then, Monster Reborn was one of the format's most powerful revival spells for a long time. Also, Monster Reborn was yet another of these cards that saw staple play in every deck that had access to it, and therefore was part of a prestige group of cards in early Yu-Gi-Oh! Referred to as the Power 5. This group of cards consisted of the aforementioned Regeki and Darkhole, but also included Monster Reborn, Change of Heart, and Pot of Greed, all incredibly powerful cards. All these cards possess the ability to win you the game with a single activation, and the amount of utility that a card like Monster Reborn offered was absolutely nuts. It could allow a player to extend plays by reviving a monster from their grave to then attribute it away for a more powerful monster such as Summon Skull, or you could also revive a big monster that was there earlier in the duel. It could also allow a player to play a little more recklessly and go for game, knowing that if their monster were to be destroyed, they could always bring it back. Not to mention that this card could also target either graveyard, so if you wanted to, you could steal a powerful monster in your opponent's graveyard and prevent them from ever activating Monster Reborn on it. There was so much this card could do that allowing it to remain a 3 made for an extremely unfair matchups. Pretty much the player that saw the most amount of copies of it was most likely going to win that duel. This card is so powerful that even today in 2022, Monster Reborn remains a niche tech choice for some decks that need a simple revival spell. Think about that. That's 20 years and this card is still somewhat relevant. So, was Konami right in limiting Monster Reborn? You betcha. They were absolutely correct in this. This card was incredibly unbalanced and there was just no other card that could do what it could do. Moving on, we have another member of the infamous Power 5, Change of Heart. Change of Heart, a normal spell card with the effect. Select and control one opposing monster, regardless of position, on the field until the end of your turn. This card is one of those cards with an inconspicuous effect that is actually extremely powerful. And because of that, this is one of those cards in Yu-Gi-Oh's history that could never be brought back to the game, at least not until they eroded the effect. Throughout the game, we've had many cards that have tried to mimic the effect of Change of Heart in one way or another, and these cards have seen a lot of play, but yet were never as strong as Change of Heart. A couple of examples that come to mind when talking about cards that are similar to that of Change of Heart and are not banned or eroded to the point they're useless are Sky Striker Mecha Widow Anchor, Crackdown, and finally, Mind Control. All of these cards are incredibly powerful, and they all try to mimic the effect of Change of Heart. But regardless, one thing they all have in common is the fact that they limit as to what you can do with the monster, or outright just require you to run a specific deck to be allowed to use it. Change of Heart was an absolute menace throughout its whole inception in the game. This card shined especially bright in all the beatdown decks that ran rampant throughout the format, since it could single-handedly make your opponent lose by just swiping one of their monsters and tributing for one of your more powerful monsters in hand, or by just taking an opponent's monster and then going for game with that. So how justified was Konami in limiting Change of Heart? Well, they were 100% correct in the limitation of this card. Change of Heart could absolutely not be allowed to be played in multiple amounts. It was just far too strong, even for this early point of the game, and absolutely deserves a place in the limited list. Alrighty, last but not least, wrapping up the list of overpowered Yu-Gi-Oh cards, we have the most iconic card of them all, their greedy jar itself, Pot of Greed. Pot of Greed. This iconic card was the very definition of overpowered, and one of the truest examples of Konami having to revise the way they designed cards from then on. This unbelievably powerful card reads, draw 2 cards from your deck. That's it, simple as that. That one single text of line is one of the most powerful effects in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! This card in the context of 2002 Yu-Gi-Oh! Was the culprit in many comeback victories or blowouts in matches. The fact that this card allowed you to dig through your deck to find some of your other overpowered spell cards, like Regeki or any of the other Power 5, made this card way too strong. To try and paint a picture of just how powerful a generic draw 2 card is, let's take a look at the successor of Pot of Greed, Pot of Desires. Pot of Desires is the normal spell card with the effect, banish 10 cards from the top of your deck face down, draw 2 cards. You can only activate 1 Pot of Desires per turn. When this card was released in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! It was a very contentious card. Some people saw this as an overpowered draw 2, others saw it as a neck 9. But regardless whether you thought this card was good or bad, one thing remained constant. Every competitive deck that could run Pot of Desires ran this card, just because of how good having a draw 2 effect is. They did not care about those cards they banished, so to see Pot of Greed, a card that has no downside whatsoever, and just lets you draw 2, is kind of wild. But even then, Pot of Desires, a card that has you give up a fourth of your deck to draw 2 cards, was seen as too powerful and placed at to 1 copy per deck. if anything, is a clear example of just how powerful Pot of Greed is. Seeing a card like Pot of Desires be limited as well should be a clear indication of just how strong it is. So it's clear to say that Konami was 100% justified in the limiting of Pot of Greed. If anything, I think Pot of Greed probably is the card that deserves to be banned the most throughout this whole list. And with that, we've covered all the cards hit in the May 2002 Forbidden Unlimited list. And if you guys did end up enjoying the video, make sure to leave a like and maybe consider subscribing for more content in the future. Also, down in the comments, let me know if you ever played this early format of Yu-Gi-Oh! And let me know whether or not I described these cards correctly. Do you remember them being as powerful as I described them, or did I do a disservice in describing them? Also, stay tuned for future videos. For the next video, I'm planning on covering the July 2002 Forbidden Unlimited list. And with that, I've been your host, Topsy Turnip. Thank you for watching my video, and have a wonderful day.